How do we start?
This is not something that should be watched casually.
I did a video last week on scandals involving all the Tory party over their 14 years, and now I've decided just to focus on the Johnson premiership, and my God, it goes on and on and on.
You know, like...
Can we get this person out?
It's a peaceful protest.
British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says his government is suspending Parliament until just 2 weeks before Brexit. The suspension would give lawmakers less time than expected to debate Britain's exit from the European Union on October 31st.
The court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
To unite and level up our country, but over the past month, you and your ministers have stoked division over footballers taking the knee, saying it was gesture politics, saying it was fans' choice to boo the team. And going back, there is further evidence of this divisive politics and language from you.
If I decide to wear a turban, or you decide to wear a cross, or he decides to wear a kippah or a skull cap, or she decides to wear a hijab or a burqa, does that mean that it is open season for right honourable members of this House to make derogatory and divisive remarks about our appearance? For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban, or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks? Racist remarks, Mr. Speaker, which have led to a spike in hate crime. And given the increasing prevalence of such incidents within his party, when will the Prime Minister finally order an inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party, something which he and his Chancellor promised on national television?
I think it's very, very important that you should recognise that Russian attempts to interfere in our elections and our referendums, whatever they may have not been successful. So you can reassure yourself on that point.
Government withholding the dossier on Russian interference in UK elections and referendums.
I can tell you, I've seen no evidence of any Russian interference in a serious point. I mean, I think that
this is a serious point.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
it's about Russian interference in UK politics.
There's no evidence for that.
Will you release the Russian report?
Let me tell you.
This is the report into whether or not there was Russian interference or any kind of influence.
There is absolutely no evidence that I know of.
If that's the case, then why not release it?
To show any interference in any British electoral event. And the reason I won't is I see no reason, or reason I decided not to ages ago, is because I see no reason to interfere with the normal timetable.
The normal timetable? Hold on, that's not true. That is not true.
Going on.
That is not true. Dominic Grieve said it should have been released on October 28th.
I just want to bring in what Number 10 have said today. They say it normally takes 6 weeks to clear these sort of reports, to investigate them thoroughly.
Forgive me, what Number 10, the press office, or whoever the spokesman has said, is completely and totally untrue. It's a lie. I really get worried about this. The process of getting this report cleared is finished. The last stage, the clearance by the Prime Minister, is programmed for 10 days. The suggestion that 6 weeks are needed is just astonishing. I really begin to worry about what the Number 10 spokesmen are saying nowadays. They're coming out with things which are quite simply whopping untruths.
Avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered.
We were told that they hadn't seen any evidence, but that is meaningless if they hadn't looked for it.
Mr. Speaker, there is no other government in the world that takes some more robust steps to protect our democracy, to protect our critical national infrastructure, and to protect our intellectual property, as I have said, from interference by Russia or by anyone else.
Story about the Russian businessman Evgeny Lebedev, who owns the Evening Standard, he owns the Independent, and his peerage. We're going to ask the government about it, but the government says that his peerage, it was all vetted, everybody who gets those is all on merit.
Well, I'm very concerned about that story because it goes to the heart of national security, and there's at least the suggestion that the government and the Prime Minister were warned that there was a national security risk in this particular appointment.
Bunga Bunga party, basically an orgy.
Certainly girls, girls, girls were promised at a party. Less burlesque, more Berlusconi. According to a former minister, it seems the Prime Minister has been entertained at these Bunga Bunga parties, hosted by his close friend, a Russian oligarch. Given his many weaknesses, could leave him open to blackmail. Why does the Prime Minister think that MI6... Why does the Prime Minister... Why does the Prime Minister think that MI6 may not entirely trust him?
The BBC has discovered evidence that a major Tory party donor was a director of a company secretly owned by a Russian oligarch close to President Putin. Lyubov Chernykin says she does not recall consenting in writing to being a director of the firm. The oligarch, Suleiman Kerimov, who's since been sanctioned by the EU and the UK, has previously denied any connection with Mrs. Chernykin.
It's been absolutely fantastic being here this morning with Matt Hancock. My second visit this week, actually, seeing some of the amazing work that the staff are doing here at the hospital in quite incredible circumstances, really. We've talked a little bit about the space capacity, etc. So...
Well, it's been good, hasn't it, to see the increase in space that there is because of the investment that we put in, and also talk to the staff and some of the patients about what more is needed. And I just really hope that you can be that strong voice for Warrington in Parliament, making the case for the hospital and for everything else that's needed in Warrington.
Absolutely. It's one of my 6-point plans, along with Andy Carter in Warrington South, to carry on going forward for a new hospital for Warrington. So vote Wendy Maisie, Warrington North, on the 12th of December.
Are you honest, Prime Minister?
I think yes, and I think that the best way to judge that is to look at what this government says it's going to do.
And if we vote leave on June the 23rd, we can take back control of £350 million a week and spend on our priorities here in this country, including on the National Health Service.
Why should we believe anything you say when it has been proven you're a habitual liar?
Well, first of all, I have a thing where I make models of... when I was in London, when I was mayor of London, we built a beautiful... I make buses.
You make models of buses?
I make models of buses.
So they're going to be in Downing Street?
So what I do... No, what I don't make models of buses, but what I make is... I get old, I don't know, wooden crates.
Yeah.
Right? And then I paint them.
So you're making cardboard buses? That's what you do to enjoy yourself?
I paint the passengers enjoying themselves.
Okay, great.
On the wonderful bus.
Okay, so 3 things about that. 1, yes, it's magnificent. 2, there's just no way that's true. But 3, if it were true, I now want nothing more than to see one of those fucking buses. Because if they're terrible, that's weird. But if they're impressive, that's somehow weirder. The very idea of the new Prime Minister painting crates buses in his spare time to relax is just endlessly fascinating.
By the way, tonight, on Christmas Eve, I have a small present for anyone who may be looking for something to read in that sleepy post-Christmas lunch moment. And here it is. Glad tidings of great joy, because this is a deal to give certainty to business and travellers and all investors in our country from the 1st of January, a deal with our friends and partners in the EU. You remember the oven-ready deal? by which we came out on January the 31st, that oven-ready deal was just the starter. This is the feast, full of fish, by the way. And I believe it will be the basis of a happy and successful and stable partnership with our friends in the EU for years to come.
Brexit is and was and will be a total disaster.
Brexit is doing the economy real damage.
Brexit, as negotiated, is frankly a disaster.
This is what we know about Brexit and the economy. In 2020, then Prime Minister Boris Johnson agreed a trade deal with the EU, in which the UK left the single market and the customs union. Mr. Johnson saw it as
a deal which will, if anything, allow our companies and our exporters to do even more business with our European friends.
That's not happened yet. This is the non-partisan Institute for Fiscal Studies.
We've lost a large fraction of our trade with the European Union, including with high-value professional services trade. That's making us poorer.
Or there's the UK's trade as a whole. The Office for Budget Responsibility is the official body that provides independent economic analysis. It's concluded there's been a 15% reduction in trade intensity as a result of Brexit. It also released this data. The red line shows UK exports. Unlike other advanced economies, the UK's exports haven't bounced back after COVID.
Small business importing. There's a real concern that your business partners in the EU will just basically think it's not worth the effort and go and sell their goods elsewhere. If you're a large business, that's less of a concern. But what you are concerned about is when your lorries are coming over the border, if you're stuck behind someone who hasn't got the right paperwork. If the new import regulations aren't working smoothly and there are delays at the border, it will add time, costs, and that will certainly see upward pressure on inflation.
The whole point about Brexit was taking back control. Conservative Brexiteers would differ to where perhaps Labour Brexiteers were. The whole point is that once you've left the EU, then it's up to the British people to elect a government that reflects their own priorities.
Oh my goodness. How are you taking back control if you're a rule taker? The UK used to be a rule maker. It used to be there at the table in Brussels writing the rules. Now it's following the rules and it has no influence over those rules.
That government can then implement the Brexit vision, if you like, that it wants.
Rejoining the single market and the customs union are, I would say, off the agenda at the moment. But that doesn't mean we can't improve things.
If you take a divorce analogy, the two partners have stopped throwing plates at each other and are now talking in a slightly cold way about sorting out some of the stuff that had to be resolved. And Rishi Sunak, to his credit, has addressed. The Northern Ireland trading dispute was sorted out. The Horizon Science Programme, which Britain has now been readmitted to as well. The government junked the proposal to have a bonfire of EU regulation with all the rules automatically expiring, something which was driving business crazy because of the uncertainty that was going to arise.
There are pragmatic, sort of more flexible things we can put in place.
The first thing you could do is start to align in various key sectors of the economy that are important for our goods manufacturers. Now, the important thing to remember is that alignment doesn't get you access. Even if you have the same rules, you still have to show up at the border with a piece of paper that shows you followed the rules, and that is cost and friction. That makes it harder to put the UK in your supply chain if you're an EU business. But nonetheless, you could do that alignment unilaterally just on the UK side, and that would make it easier for business.
I think for the Conservatives, it's very difficult to say that the UK would just remain aligned with evolving rules that are drawn up by the EU. I think for Labour, there is a sense, talking at least to frontbenchers privately, that they want to strip out the ideology from some of these issues. They want to make pragmatic choices about when to diverge and when to remain aligned.
Okay, I don't understand what pragmatic ways it would be to diverge from EU standards. But anyway, the key word here, of course, as I said at the beginning, was alignment. Alignment will be the first step towards rejoining the European Union and the single market. And why is it so important? It's because if you align to EU standards, you tell businesses, this is what you need to do. These are the standards you need to respect. And of course, it's not going to stop the friction completely at the border, but it will make it easier for businesses, because if businesses are being told you need to diverge from EU standards but still sell into the biggest market on your doorstep, the EU single market, then it's a massive problem for businesses. So alignment makes perfect sense. This is the first step. It makes it easier for businesses because they know, okay, these are the standards we need to follow. And then when the UK eventually rejoins the European Union and eventually the single market, that adjustment has already taken place.
You saying to Wes that Keir Starmer is saying anything to get a vote is a bit rich coming from a Tory, let me tell you. We're still waiting on the £350 million a week Boris Johnson promised us.
It's coming. It's here. It's here.
Whoa!
It is.
For the NHS, you're saying?
Yeah,
the NHS, yeah.
It is, Paddy and Fred.
Well, where is it?
It's been put into the NHS.
Why is the NHS on its knees?
46.5 billion over the next 3 years.
Why is the NHS on its knees if it's here? Why are they going on strike, nurses and doctors, if it's here?
The NHS.
Where is it?
For jobs has protected.
Are you going to do
businesses.
anything about the ambulances waiting and the people dying out? Well, don't you think 12 years is long enough?
Yes, and we
12
are
years,
taking...
you've done bugger all about it. People have died and all you've done is nothing.
The whole of the UK is always well prepared for these types of outbreaks.
For these plans that they fundamentally didn't exist.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody. You'll be pleased to know.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been admitted to intensive care with those persistent symptoms of coronavirus. So
I thought that people wanted to know the right thing to do. I wanted to know the right thing to do. You know, should we be keeping our children off school if they had a cough? Should we be seeing vulnerable people and grandparents? It really wasn't clear, and I happen to have great faith and confidence in that most of the time people will do the right thing. And I felt it was that disconnect that I felt so strongly that actually, if we could just tell people what the right and kind and proper thing to do is, people would do that. And sitting there and saying it was great and sort of laughing at the Italians was just, it just felt completely, well, it felt how it sounds. Sort of laughing at the Italians, sort of laughing at the Italians, sort of laughing at the Italians.
I have to admit, I find that plausible.
It doesn't matter if you've got great people doing communications if the Prime Minister changes his mind 10 times a day and then calls up the media and contradicts his own policy day after day after day. You're going to have a communications disaster zone.
Saying, don't go to work, go to work. Don't take public transport, go to work, don't go to work. Stay indoors. If you can work from home, go to work. Don't go to work. Go outside, don't go outside. And then we will or won't, something or other.
how long is this casual sex ban going to last? You're saying that no social distancing needed in established relationships. It's okay to smile.
In these rules that we have to bring in, you have to have there have to be boundaries to coin a phrase.
You know, established relationship. Does that mean if I say I love you? Because some people say that and they don't mean it. But are you in an established relationship then? I don't know.
I think we should stick to the letter of it. To start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care home. The protection, that ring of protection around care homes is important. Well, we absolutely did throw a protective ring around social care.
The effect of COVID-19 on care homes in Britain has been devastating. These are places where the elderly and frail should hope to live out their lives in comfort and safety.
We're here, Dad.
And yet, at least a quarter of all COVID-19 deaths have taken place in the sector, which lies outside Britain's National Health Service.
Can you explain why we currently have the worst death rate in the world? And can you explain why we have one of the highest death tolls in the world? If we did everything right, how have we ended up here?
Well, as I say, we've been learning throughout this process, working with scientific advisors on trying to take the appropriate policies. There'll be a variety of reasons why people, unfortunately, have died due to this. Some of that will be recognising the age of our population. Some of that will be recognising the obesity of our population.
Listen, I applaud you for giving us some reasons, because none of
that's the first time we've heard a government minister settle on a couple of explanations.
Right, none of your colleagues last week could give us any. So you've given us two now, ageing population and obesity. So are you saying that the reason for us having the worst death rate in the world is because of the public? They're too old and they're too fat?
I think that's a very insulting thing that you've just said.
You just said it.
is unconscious age of our population. Some of that will be recognising the obesity of our population.
Opposite of the world as Transport Secretary. He has done nothing. I would ask him what on earth he's been doing for the last 9 months. No airport testing, screening or measures since the pandemic began. None. No temperature checks, no health assessments, no flight restrictions throughout this entire pandemic. No measures to have air travel actually acknowledge we're in a pandemic. The lack of measures have contributed to the worst death toll in Europe, and he detailed what every other country has been doing. So I put it to you, what have you done?
For these plans that they fundamentally didn't exist.
Take the word of Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, at PMQs on the 6th of May 2020. It's been enraging to see the difficulties we've had in supplying PPE to those who need it. But the government's now engaged in a massive plan to ramp up domestic supply. Matt Hancock on the BBC, 11th of April. The challenge is one of distribution. Alok Sharma, there's clearly a need for more gowns, he told Andrew Marr on the 12th of April. Clearly a need for more PPE. We didn't have enough PPE. That's why people were wearing bin liners. That's why so many health workers died on the front line. Why can't you as a government? Once again, it's that old thing of refusing to admit when you got it wrong. We know we were not prepared with enough PPE. Just admit it.
Eyesight, Mr. Cummings. The Prime Minister's top aide, Dominic Cummings, is facing calls to resign after travelling more than 250 miles with his wife, who had suspected coronavirus, to be near relatives during the lockdown.
Now let's talk about herd immunity. It's how a community, especially vulnerable people who can't be vaccinated themselves, are protected. Here's the problem. Those most at risk, like young babies, the elderly, and those with existing health conditions could get infected.
Herd immunity as well, so that more people are immune to this disease and we reduce the transmission. At the same time, we protect those who are most vulnerable from it.
Yeah, I mean, that herd immunity, I know you talked about yesterday when you were appearing with the Prime Minister. In terms of building up a herd immunity within the UK, what sort of percentage of people need to have contracted the virus?
Probably about 60% or so. And we think that this virus is likely to be one that comes back year on year, become like a seasonal virus, and communities will become immune to it. And that's going to be an important part of controlling this longer term.
60%?
60% is the sort of figure you need to get herd immunity.
I mean, even with that, even looking at the sort of the best case scenario, I know we were talking last week and you were saying, you know, half of 1% to 1% fatality in something like this, that's an awful lot of people dying in this country.
Well, I mean, of course, we do face the prospect of, as the Prime Minister said yesterday, of an increasing number of people dying. That is a real prospect. This is a nasty disease.
And the attempt by the British government to deny what your own Chief Scientific Advisor said on the record then, I'm afraid will not survive a public inquiry, because he said it on the record on radio.
We were not following a policy of herd immunity.
Why did he say we were?
You will have to ask Sir Patrick, a great man who offers
So he didn't know what
advice.
policy the government was following, and he's your Chief Scientific Advisor.
Yes, but I'm the Minister, and I'm telling you that we were not following a policy.
So you were following
of herd
the
immunity.
science, but ignoring the science.
Our policy is informed by the science, and one of the reasons.
Yeah, but you said at the time you were following the science. You can't be informed and following it and then ignoring it. It's either one or the other. You're either following it or you're not. I can go back and play 100 clips of ministers saying you were following the science. You said it every single day. Now you're saying the Chief Scientific Advisor had no idea what he was talking about and was talking about a policy that none of you were following.
No, I'm not saying that he had no idea what he was talking about. He knows a great deal more about these issues than a number of commentators. But the whole point is that when you receive scientific advice, you weigh it against a number of different considerations.
So he advised you to pursue herd immunity and you said no. Is that the new position?
No. It is the case that scientific advisors and other advisors lay out a range of facts and a range of options, and they allow ministers to look at that. Obviously, there is a boundary. There are some things that any government could do which would be in defiance of the science, but the whole point about scientific advice is that it lays out that there's
well, that's what we
necessarily
kept saying. But
uncertainty in the way in which decisions are taken.
You lot kept telling us you were following the science. Now you're guided by it, but then end up doing different things. I'm just saying the record will speak for itself. You can go back and listen to all the interviews. I know what Patrick Vallance said. I know what he said because I heard it on the radio. Anyway.
Yes, but I know how these decisions were taken. I don't think you were in the room.
No, but I'll tell you where I will be in the room. I wasn't allowed to be in the room, but I will be in the room for the public inquiry, Mr. Gove. I mean, just simple words there, reacting it. You're quite emotional by that.
Well, it's just, it's been such a tough year for so many people, and there's William Shakespeare putting it so simply for everybody that, we can get on with our lives.
Like, for example, the whole thing with Rashford. The Director of Communications said to the Prime Minister twice, do not pick a fight with Rashford. Obviously, we should do this instead. The Prime Minister decided to pick a fight and then surrendered twice. After that, everyone says, oh, well, your communications is stupid. No. What's stupid is picking a fight with Rashford over school meals, and what should have happened is just getting the school meals policy right. So it's easy to blame...
Marcus Rashford. In April, there was some criticism of footballers' reluctance to take a pay cut while others were being furloughed. You said that as part of a news conference. You said they should do their bit. He has certainly done his. Round of applause for him. An embarrassing U-turn for the government by any measure.
I think it's just fantastic. I absolutely applaud what Marcus Rashford's been doing. And not only he's campaigned on this issue that he clearly feels very, very strongly about, but also he has himself directly been volunteering. I think it's absolutely terrific. And I pay tribute to him.
Yeah, Secretary of State, that wasn't my question. My point was that I was chatting to your colleague Grant Shapps this time yesterday, and he was saying, we're definitely not doing this, we're doing enough, sorry about that, gave me all the other money that you were giving to local government, but he said, this is not going to change. By lunchtime, you'd done a volte-face.
Righty-ho. Well, I'll tell you what happened. The Prime Minister talked to Daniel Rashford. He considered it and made his decision. I think it's terrific. I'm in favour of making sure we get as much support as possible to people who obviously, that are in difficult circumstances, especially with coronavirus this summer. So I welcome the Prime Minister's decision, and I'm just really, I think that Marcus Rashford has done a great thing in the volunteering that he's done, and I think that he ran a great campaign. Just made it so clear in that video, just how it was so passionate.
If you have an old kettle that takes ages to boil, it may cost you £20 to replace it. But if you get a new one, you'll save £10 a year for every year on your £10 a year every year on your electricity bill.
Begin by saying that I understand and share the anger up and down the country at seeing Number 10 staff seeming to make light of lockdown measures. And I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, Mr. Speaker, because I was also furious to see that clip. And, Mr. Speaker, I apologise unreservedly for the offence that it has caused up and down the country, and I apologise for the impression that it gives.
They weren't parties.
Well, it seems a lot of people attended events in May 2020. The one I recall attending was my grandmother's funeral. She was a wonderful woman. As well as a love for her family, she served her community as a councillor, and she served Dartford Conservative Association loyally for many years. I drove for 3 hours from Staffordshire to Kent. Only 10 people at the funeral. Many people who loved her had to watch online. I didn't hug my siblings. I didn't hug my parents. I gave a eulogy. And then afterwards, I didn't even go to her house for a cup of tea. I drove back 3 hours from Kent to Staffordshire. Does the Prime Minister think I'm a fool?
This is the story of one of the biggest corporate scandals since the global financial crisis.
With supply chain finance from Greensill.
You use terms like financial engineering, disruption, democratization of finance. You spice with mystique, get a few endorsements from the good and great, then you stir it, and then you serve it out to the ignorant customers and investors as something very clever, glamorous, and innovative.
The tale of an Australian who wooed the rich and powerful on his way to becoming a billionaire.
I was paid an annual amount, a generous annual amount, far more than what I earned as Prime Minister.
Lex bought credibility really well. He associated himself with politicians, with famous people. He looked the part.
He's been a brilliant salesman and he's had an incredible ambition.
Greensill, changing finance to change the world.
Friday the 13th of August. The Taliban are about to capture Kabul, but where was the Foreign Secretary? Reportedly here, a luxury Greek beach resort apparently too busy to make an important phone call. Told by Foreign Office officials to reach out to his Afghan counterpart to ensure the safe evacuation of interpreters, he left it to a junior minister.
Elite counter-terrorist forces, both the army commandos mentored by UK Special Forces and the intelligence specialists who provided the critical information needed to stop countless attacks. Astoundingly, we've learned many of these people have been left behind and the Taliban are hunting them.
There's no doubt that they will be hunted down, they will be interrogated and questioned extensively to start with, to identify the intelligence which they have, which will be of use to the Taliban, and then in all likelihood, the highest probability that they will be executed.
The newspapers this morning, Afghans killed as Whitehall worked from home, Afghans left to die in Kabul. This is, of course, when you were in post as Foreign Secretary, the suggestion that it was dysfunctional, chaotic, people were left to die at the hands of the Taliban. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, it was a very difficult set of operational conditions, but I'd point to the fact that in just 2 weeks, we secured the evacuation of 15,000
Well, how many more might you have done if it wasn't so dysfunctional?
A desperate scene unfolds at the Kabul airport. People here in the capital are utterly petrified and essentially have nowhere to look to now.
I might face consequences that I never even dreamed of.
The Taliban stormed into Kabul. Images emerging of insurgents in the country's equivalent of the Oval Office.
The British and the Americans have spent billions, but the policy has been an abject failure.
This war used to be called Operation Enduring Freedom, and it's turned out not to be enduring, and they're not leaving behind a society that is free.
The so-called whistleblower, Raphael, do you remember Mr. Marshall, Raphael Marshall?
I don't, but he was a relatively junior desk officer. But again, you know, as with many people, I mean, operating under a lot of strain, and a lot of pressure.
He claims that in one instance he was the only person who was actually working because of the working from home culture. Can you see if that's? Do you think that might be correct?
You're going to resign, Mr. Rudd. 12 locations around Westminster were tested for drugs using the same wipes often used in clubs, with some of these locations only accessible to those with high clearance passes. Of the 12 locations, 11 tested positive for cocaine, which is more than 90% of locations, including the bathroom nearest both Johnson and Patel's offices, as well as throughout the Houses of Parliament.
I don't know if you've been to Peppa Pig World. Hands up anyone who's been to Peppa Pig World? Not enough. I was a bit hazy what I would find at Peppa Pig World, but I loved it. And Peppa Pig World is very much my kind of place. It has very safe streets, discipline in schools, heavy emphasis on new mass transit systems, I notice, even if they're a bit stereotypical about Daddy Pig. But the real lesson for me, going to Peppa Pig World, and I'm surprised you haven't been there, was about the power of UK creativity. Who would have believed, Tony, that a pig that looks like a hairdryer, or possibly a sort of Picasso-like hairdryer, a pig that was rejected by the BBC, would now be exported to 180 countries with theme parks both in in America and in China, as well as in the New Forest.
Patricia Durr, she's the CEO of the organisation Every Child Protected Against Trafficking. Thanks very much indeed for making the time to speak to us today on France 24. Just tell us, first of all, what was your reaction when you heard this news that dozens of children were going missing in this way while supposedly under the care of the government?
200 of the children remain missing, and only one of these is female.
What we know is that as of October last year, there were 222 children across all of the hotels that had gone missing and not been found. What we know from this recent information is localised to the Brighton and Hove area. And as you said, there kind of remain over 70 children unaccounted for. Our concern about all of those children, I mean, any child going missing is a grave concern, but our concern about those children is that we don't really know what's happened to them, but the evidence from the Observer over the weekend is that there have been eyewitness accounts of children being taken, so abducted, by what is said to be criminal gangs.
Universal credit, what the Chancellor has done by changing the way the tax is paid on it is effectively give a tax cut to people worth £1,000 on universal credit.
Plus, Prime Minister, you took away £1,000 from people on universal credit.
They were sacked suddenly and unexpectedly, but surprise quickly turns to anger at Port of Dover. Everyone here worked at sea for P&O, from cooks to cleaners to ship's captains. They're all now unemployed.
With breaking news, the former Conservative MP Imran Ahmad Khan has been jailed today for 18 months for sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy back in 2008.
So is your decision based on an acknowledgement of wrongdoing?
Yes, and I'll explain to you exactly what it is.
OK.
The situation was that funnily enough, it was tractors I was looking at, and so I did get into another website that had a sort of very similar name, and I watched it for a bit, which I shouldn't have done. But my biggest crime, is that on another occasion I went in a second time.
And that was deliberately?
And that was deliberate.
And was that in the Select Committee or in the Commons Chamber?
That was sitting, waiting to vote.
And Owen Paterson once more facing suspension for lobbying for cash. The man at the centre of all of this was out shopping when he discovered from the media he was again facing sanction. Defiance turned to resignation.
Hungary in one of the world's richest countries seems almost unbelievable. But data shows more people than ever are relying on food handouts. I'm loving it, the slogan of the world's most famous fast food chain. But it seems in the UK, many can't afford to love it. Figures show there are now more food banks in this country than branches of McDonald's. And given the fast food chain can be found on pretty much every corner, that's an awful lot of food banks.
Downing Street has defended the Education Secretary, saying he is not racist. It follows criticism of Gavin Williamson after he admitted confusing the England footballer Marcus Rashford with the rugby player Maro Itoje.
A group of whips so disliked him that they had a discussion about whether they could come in early one morning, release the pet tarantula and stamp it to death.
Is he racist or incompetent?
You'll forgive me saying, I again have probably seen no more of this than what you have seen.
Well,
I know
what more
that
do you? He's mixed
explained...
up two prominent English black sportsmen. He's got them the wrong way round. I repeat my question: is this through incompetence or racism, Minister?
Honestly, I don't know.
Cabinet Minister Sir Gavin Williamson steps down over allegations of bullying.
Bullying is never acceptable. Every school must have anti-bullying policies in place so that no pupil fears coming to school or working online. we can make sure every child grows up feeling confident and free to be themselves and stamp out bullying.
So Gavin said,
always tell them to off, and if they have the to come and see me, jumped up civil servants.
This is a man who, when he was chief whip himself, was known as the baby-faced assassin. He had an actual whip on his desk as well as a pet tarantula.
This morning, the Deputy Prime Minister finally acknowledged formal complaints about his misconduct, but his letter contains no hint of admission or apology. This is anti-bullying week. Will he apologise?
Bullying is never acceptable.
After months of waiting, the official verdict is in on Priti Patel's behaviour, and it's hard reading for the Home Secretary. The report by the Independent Advisor on Standards says there are occasions of shouting and swearing at civil servants. But most importantly, he says, my advice is that the Home Secretary has not consistently met the high standards required by the Ministerial Code of treating her civil servants with consideration and respect.
Bullying is never acceptable.
In a big blow to the British broadcaster, BBC chairperson Richard Sharp has resigned. He stepped down from his post over a report into whether he failed to properly disclose his involvement in the facilitation of a loan to former Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
According to a survey by the Pharmaceutical Journal, more than half of UK pharmacists say medicine shortages have put patients at risk in the last 6 months.
We just had a Cabinet Committee meeting to discuss it. But we are constantly looking at ideas in order to ensure that we relieve the pressure on people who are facing incredibly tough times. But that doesn't amount to an emergency budget, which is what some people immediately thought that it did. It is an example of some commentators chasing their own tails and trying to take a statement that is commonsensical, turning it into a major capital letters, a big news story, and in fact, when the Treasury quite rightly say, calm down, then people, instead of recognising that they've overinflated the story in the first place, then say, oh, this is clearly a split. And someone like Ed Davey, I know, I worked with Ed in the past, I recognise his talent for this sort of thing, immediately steps into this media whirlpool and attempts to stir it even further.
Leader of the opposition, a former Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Speaker. So he spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savel, as far as I can make out, Mr. Speaker.
One comment I would make is I think an awful lot of money, an awful lot of police time now goes into these historic offences and all this malarkey, and 60 million pounds I saw was being spaffed up the wall on some investigation into historic child abuse and all this kind of thing. I mean, what on earth is that going to do to protect the public now?
A few months ago, you said in a radio interview that lots of local police forces were spaffing money up the wall. Is that something you still believe on investigations of historic CSE?
Well, that's actually not what I said.
Vast experience working in the north of England. I know one of the cases that you were involved in was the Jimmy Savile case. I just want to move on a little bit to it. We've been speaking about this morning already with Michael Gove. You defended Sir Keir Starmer after the Prime Minister's comments in the House of Commons on Monday. What do you make of what Boris Johnson said about Sir Keir Starmer in relation to the Jimmy Savile case?
Well, like Michael Gove, I'll stick to the facts. The facts are every prosecutor is independent and operates applying the code for prosecutors and the policy. And what happened in Savile's case was police... In fact, the critical decision that was wrong in that case, the original investigation, was the police told each of the victims there is no other victim. So they did not know there was 3 others. And of course, each of them then said, I don't want to stand in a witness box on my own facing Jimmy Savile. So the prosecutor, that was whoever it was in CPS South East at the time, said, well, these women aren't prepared to give evidence. That was the view taken by the police. I'm not going to prosecute it. That was a critical decision. And that was taken before even Keir was DPP, by the way. So then the decision was taken not to prosecute it. I didn't know it. Keir didn't know it. Nobody knew about it. It was dealt with locally as it should be. As it always is done by policy. As soon as he became aware of it, which we only did after Savile's death, Keir changed everything. I mean, literally, he put me in charge of child sexual abuse nationally. We brought in new guidelines, new policy, specialist prosecutor. We trained everybody. And in the 3 years that followed, when Keir left and I left the CPS, I think when we left, we had the highest conviction rate for child sexual abuse in our history. That is his legacy. That's Keir Starmer's legacy. Boris Johnson more recently said that prosecuting or investigating child sexual abuse was money spaffed up a wall. There you go. There's two different views as to how child sexual abuse should be dealt with.
Pincher has been one of the Prime Minister's strongest backers in the House of Commons, and Boris Johnson made him Deputy Chief Whip, responsible for MPs' discipline. But last night he quit government after a drunken incident at a club. Ministers spent the morning fending off questions about whether he should also be kicked out of the parliamentary party.
I think it's absolutely right that the Chief Whip and others spend today just trying to ascertain exactly what happened, what the circumstances were, and therefore what to do next.
Neil Parish, who was kicked out after watching pornography in the Commons, thought Mr Pincher was getting preferential treatment.
I am very cross about that because the first thing they did to me was remove the whip. And I think in order to be equal and treat people equally, they must at very least do the same.
But this evening, after a formal complaint was made to Parliament's grievance scheme, the Conservatives did suspend the whip from Chris Pincher, pending the outcome of the investigation.
We've just been handed a letter which the former top civil servant at the Foreign Office has sent by email to the Standards Commissioner. Now, this is Simon MacDonald of Salford, permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office between 2015 and 2020, and it relates to Chris Pincher. 5 days, he says, after Mr Pincher's resignation as Deputy Chief Whip, there remains significant confusion surrounding complaints about his behaviour prior to the drunkenness that he admits at the Carlton Club last week. The former top civil servant goes on to say inaccurate claims by 10 Downing Street continue to be repeated. The BBC website reported that no official complaints against Mr Pincher were ever made. This is not true, says this former top civil servant, and goes on to explain that in the summer of 2019, shortly after he was appointed a foreign minister, a group of officials complained about Mr Pincher's behaviour. Those complaints were discussed with the relevant official at the Cabinet Office. In substance, the allegations were similar to those made about his behaviour at the Carlton Club. An investigation upheld the complaint, and Mr Pincher apologised and promised not to repeat the behaviour. The same BBC website report continued. Downing Street said Mr Johnson was not aware of any specific allegations when he appointed Mr Pincher Deputy Chief Whip in February. The original number 10 line is not true.
Like many on these benches, I spent weeks and months defending the Prime Minister against often angry constituents. I've reminded them of his success in delivering Brexit and on the vaccine and many other things.
Once again, thank you to all of my Patreon and YouTube members. You keep this channel going and growing. If you'd like to support me, please look at the link in the description. Otherwise, you can always just press the like and subscribe button. It's free and it helps the channel grow. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Hasta la vista, baby.